Hey, Whappers, welcome in. And this is an unusual location for our ATW this week. I'm here in the Basis Chandler Faculty Lounge. As you can see behind me, we've got our staff refrigerator. The microwave is not missing. I can attest to that. The microwave is here in the staff lounge, although the picture of Mr. Ray looks pretty good up there. And I'm also casual today because I'm waiting on you all to come in to take your mocks. So when you're done with your mock, I know the first thing you're going to do is rush home and watch the ATW. So let's get down to business, where today we're talking about China. And the continuation of the themes that we left off with in class on Friday is going to be how Europeans began to infiltrate and take China slowly over the course of the late 19th century. To recap the issues we went over in class this week, China was slowly declining in power. That all stemmed from the fact that China was not industrialized. And that leads to the adage, you're going to hear me say this tonight on the video, and you're going to hear me say this a lot next week in class. If you don't industrialize, you get imperialized. And that is going to be the motto that we're going to carry forward with us for the rest of the week as we begin talking about imperialism. Imperialism is quite simply interchangeable with the idea of colonialism. European powers, or any power for that matter, really, if you talk about imperialism, European powers, or any power really, were beginning to go out and once again, for the second time in world history, take over territories and bring them under their control, under their imperial control. China had long withstood the European influence, despite the fact that Europeans had taken key city-states in China, like the Portuguese in Macau or the British in Hong Kong. But the weakness of the Qing leadership led to a downfall in their centralized government, and coupled with internal problems like the Taiping Rebellion and the influx of opium trade, China was weakening to the point of full collapse. And the only thing holding the Qing together was they were powerful in the north, where, of course, they had invaded China from. But in the south, all along the coast, the Europeans were beginning to mount invasions. And the Europeans, and I mean Europeans collectively here, this wasn't just the British. Although the British were one of the first to have a foothold in China, other European countries like Germany, France, even Asian countries like Japan, which defeated the Chinese in the Sino-Japanese War, like we talked about on Friday, everybody was coming in for a piece of the pie. And that's what the cartoon that I'm going to put up here highlights. Everybody was coming in to carve up a slice of China. And these slices of China were what historians refer to as spheres of influence. Effectively, each European nation and each Asian nation like Japan came in with their military, with their industrial might, their high-powered steamships and warships, their artillery, their cannons, and basically at the threat of force, they took over slices of China. European powers had different sections of the country carved out. And in those sections, the Europeans effectively controlled everything. They had their own governments, they had all the trade, and they had a military presence in those sections of China. These spheres of influence were the Qing leadership's worst nightmare. There was no getting rid of the Europeans. The Opium Wars were their chance, but the British got that foot in the door, and that opened up the door for even more Europeans. And not only are they losing ground, but culturally, the Chinese are under attack for really the first time in their culture's history. There had never been a true threat to the breakdown and the erosion of Chinese culture. But European might, European industrialism won the day. And the self-strengthening program that the Qing tried to enact just simply was not able to withstand the brunt of so many attacks by the Europeans. What makes China an anomaly here in the late 19th century is the fact that although the Europeans had colonized and imperialized elsewhere in world history up to this point, there had never been something like this where so many countries came in to one territory. Maybe India at first, when the Portuguese, the French, the English, the Dutch had gone into India. But this was a whole nother level. And China was literally being just taken and picked apart one by one. And there was one noticeable missing player in the spheres of influence, and that's the United States. The United States was mounting on its own right a severe increase in industrialization. And therefore, because the United States industrialized, they began to have the power to imperialize. And the U.S. was imperializing elsewhere in the world, most notably in the Philippines, which they had taken in a war from Spain, and also in Latin America, where they had conquered places after defeating the Spanish army in Latin America. So the United States proposed, and this is kind of a really interesting moment for the United States in American history. The United States proposed a bold plan which urged the Europeans to make China an open door. See, I use that analogy, get your foot in the door, in class the other day, because ultimately what the U.S. was calling for China was an open door policy. That meant that anybody could come into China, anybody could come in and take what they wanted. The United States wanted China to be open for everybody. The Europeans, of course, were reluctant to do that because they wanted to keep their spheres. But ultimately, the U.S. became very involved in China as well. So you've got European powers, industrial powers, and you've got American industrial powers, and you've got Asian industrial power like Japan. And we'll get into Japan's rise to power next week. So what's the response going to be? Well, the Qing had very little they could do. They were overmatched, outpowered, outgunned, outmaneuvered. They were pretty much sitting ducks. But traditionalists in Chinese society, mostly Confucianists that rejected the Qing leadership, mounted a severe attempt to drive the Europeans out. Another rebellion broke out within China, and this rebellion was known as the Boxer Rebellion. Like a boxer, like put up your fists. The Boxers were traditionalist Chinese Confucians who wanted to drive European and American and Japanese influence out of their country. The Boxers got their nickname because they formed as a group known as the Society of Harmonious Fists. Society of Harmonious Fists. And they were skilled martial artists trained in military tactics as well. The Boxer Rebellion proved to be a unique response in China because this was not the Qing leadership organizing some sort of pushback against the Europeans. Rather, this was internally Chinese citizens trying to drive the Europeans out. The Boxers were quite successful. They would attack European ships. They would hit trade cities. They resorted to sort of guerrilla warfare style tactics, domestic terrorism, so to speak, blowing up factories and whatnot. And the Boxers were proving to be quite the nuisance to the Americans and Europeans. Ultimately, one of the more fascinating developments in this whole saga of China and the open door policy and spheres of influence is that ultimately a coalition army of Europeans and Americans, yes, the American military was sent to China to help fend off and fight off the Boxers. Ultimately, a coalition force of multi-nation army was formed to fight against the Boxers and to drive the Boxers out. This is great past shapes the future for modern-day conflicts where the United Nations, which we'll get into eventually, where the United Nations looks to create an army of multinational forces, and they go into battle and fight against fighting conflicts together. The Boxers were ultimately defeated. They could not withstand the pressure of this multinational force, and so things in China continued the way they were. The Europeans, the Americans, the Japanese continued with their spheres of influence. It wasn't until 1912 when the Qing Empire finally collapsed. The Qing Empire collapsed, and ultimately what replaced the Qing Empire was a new republic. China would go in a very short period of time from 2,000 plus years of imperial rule, monarchies and emperors, to a republic where an elected leader was voted to take over the government of China. One of the key leaders of this new republic movement in China was Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen should always be associated with the beginning. He was the first president of China in 1912, after China had converted to becoming a republic, Sun Yat-sen. And over the next 20 or so years, China will dramatically modernize, and China is going to go through a period of stability for about 20 years. The Republic of China will be well received by the Europeans and the Americans because of trade. And ultimately, Sun Yat-sen is going to give way to the next president of China, which is going to be a very important name in world history, Chiang Kai-shek. And we'll be going over him more down the road. So China goes from 2,000 plus years of imperial rule to, within a very short period of time, China will become a republic. And they'll have an elected leader, and they're going to modernize and industrialize. And we're going to sort of be dormant on China now for a little while before we get back to them at the beginning of World War II, when China will find themselves under siege by not Europeans this time, but by the Japanese. And that's going to instigate a new era in Chinese history. So we leave China for now, knowing that China could not industrialize, and therefore it was imperialized. And ultimately, China elected its own president for the very first time and became a republic officially in 1912. And that is a remarkable turnaround and a remarkable shift in Chinese history. So I'll leave you with that. Good luck today on the mocks. You'll be taking it shortly. Have a great rest of your weekend. It's a beautiful weekend. Make sure you go outside and get some exercise and all that. As always, I'll remind you all that the past shapes the future. Have a good night, Whappers. Take care.